Seches Moed Katan Daf Vez has two primary sugyas. The first is the halacha of the gadol habayis. That is when someone was not at the beginning of Shiva and he comes in the middle. Can he join the counting of the Shiva, or does he have to keep his own count? Tomorrow we'll discuss a number of factors that are involved. As part of that topic, tomorrow we'll discuss when Shiva begins for different avelim if they leave the mace at different times. The Gemara will then have a lengthy discussion as to what the halacha is in that case. And then the Gemara will go to comparing avelos of the father and mother, avelos for a parent, to other types of mourning, and a long list of halachas that are different in those different situations, and a brief discussion of each. So first of all, we're discussing the halacha of someone who came late to the Shiva. That is, he arrived at the Shiva house where the other avelim were sitting Shiva not at the same time that they did. His avelos began later. Now the Gemara is going to say in a few lines, he may have a very good reason that his avelos began later. It's not necessarily because he found out about the Petira later, or that he came late. It could be that his Shiva actually started later, because the halacha is that Shiva begins when one departs from the mace. So for example, if the mace was nifter in Chutz La'aretz, and then he was being transported to Eretz Yisrael for the burial, the one who goes along with him will not have his Shiva begin until the burial actually happens, until what the Gemara calls Nistam Hagayil, until the coffin is covered. However, those who didn't go along, as soon as they turn away from the mace, that is when their Shiva begins. So the question is, when this one comes, does his Shiva join with their counting, and therefore he loses a few days of the Shiva because they started earlier, or does he keep to his own count? So the Gemara begins with a brisa, the last few lines in Avchaf Aleph, that says that there are three conditions for one's Shiva to join the counting of one that's already in progress. Condition number one is that he came from a close place, he wasn't far away. Condition number two is that he came within the first 3 days of the Shiva. That the Gemara quotes another opinion, that's a machlokes. Rav Shimon says even if he came on the 7th day, he can still use their counting, even though he'll have only 1 day, even less than a day, according to Abba Shalom Mixazim Kikulo. And the third condition is that the gadol habayis, the senior member of the avelim, was in the place that he arrived at. He's joining the count of the gadol habayis. He himself is not the gadol habayis, he's joining the count of the gadol habayis. So now the Gemara's question is, what if the gadol habayis went to the cemetery? That is, the gadol habayis is the one who's arriving late, but not because he was delayed or held up, but because he was busy dealing with the mace this entire time. If that's the situation, he shouldn't have to do his own counting, because what he was doing up to now was part of the activities to care for the mace itself. What is the halacha in a situation like that? So the Gemara says that Rav Yochanan has paskin that he does not, that he counts along with them. He does not have to start his own counting when he begins, when he turns away. The Gemara asks that there's a brisa that says that he does have to do his own counting. The Gemara answers that it depends if it was within the first 3 days or after the first 3 days. Rav Yochanan was referring to within the first 3 days, then he can join the avelis already in progress, and the brisa is referring to after the first 3 days, then he has to start his own counting. And then the Gemara quotes that Rav said to the people of Salfuni, if you come within 3 days, then you can join the avelis in progress, otherwise you have to start your own counting. Now, Rav also spelled out halacha, which we said before. He said to the people of Mechuzah that if you're having a nifter transported to Eretz Yisrael, those who don't go along, as soon as they turn away, they start avelos, but the ones who go along start when the actual burial happens. All right, now the Gemara wants to talk about Rav Shimon's opinion. Rav Shimon had said that it's within the first, that he can join the avelos in progress even if it's on day 7. So the Gemara says that's only if he came before they got up. If they got up already, meaning they ended their Shiva, they did Mixas Yom Kikulo, and they ended it, the Gemara refers to it as there are no more menachamim by him. The Shiva has ended, there's no one there anymore to console them, they've already ended Shiva. So if they've ended a Shiva, he can't join it, he has to start his own. But if they're still there, then he can. Now the Gemara says, what's the halacha? If they began arranging themselves to get up, that means that they concluded the Shiva, but did not actually stand up and go. So that the Gemara says is a question which will have to stand. We don't have an answer for that. Now what is the halacha here? So the Gemara has a complicated list of different opinions as to what the halacha is. First of all, the Gemara quotes either Rabbi Zera, who asked his friend Rabbi Abba Bar Chia, or Rabbi Bar Chia who asked his friend Rabbi Zera. One of them asked each other. One of them asked the other. I'm not sure who asked who, but they said that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon in Hilchas Avelos, And he also said that Allah is like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel in Hilchos Treifus. What's that about? The Gemara says there's a discussion in Hilchos Treifus. What happens if one of the internal organs got a hole and it's sealed up by one of the internal fluids, and therefore you have a hole, but it's a sealed hole? Does that count as treif or not? And there Rav Shimon ben Gamliel goes leniently. Here also in Avelis, you have Rav Shimon goes leniently. Says Rabbi Abba, possibly Rabbi Zera. In both circumstances, we rule leniently, like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel in treifus, and like Rav Shimon in Avelis. Then the Gemara says there was somebody who wanted to hear this from the person himself, who if it was Rabbi Abba or Rabbi Chia. So the Gemara says he went up and he spoke to Rabbi Abba, the son of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. And he said, did you say that the halacha is like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel in treifus? And he said, no. I said the opposite. I said the halacha is not like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel in treifus. Okay, so that was wrong. But what did he say about the halacha of Avelos? Did he pass like Rav Shimon leniently that you can join in day 7 or not? So again, the Gemara has a number of opinions. The Gemara says Rav Chisda says yes, Rav Yochanan says yes, Rav Nachman says no. Rav Nachman also says we don't pass like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel in treifus. All right, what's the bottom line in all this? The Gemara says the bottom line is that we do paskin like Rabbi Shimon in Avelis, because we always go leniently in Hilchos Avelis, a rule that Shmuel has said, which we've seen many times in the Masechta. We always go leniently in the halachos of Avelis. Okay, now the Gemara begins its second sugya of the daf, and that is comparing the Avelis of a parent to the Avelis of another relative. So the Gemara says, first of all, if you rush the kvura, if you rush up the burial, so if you do that for another relative, that's a good thing to do, that's praiseworthy. If one is to do that for his parent, that is considered to be meguna, that's not the right thing to do. It is not for the kavod of the parent to rush the burial. We should wait until have more people there. However, unless it's Erev Shabbos or it's Erev Yontiv, then it's the correct thing to do. Now, are you allowed to do work while one is in Aval? So this is a bit confusing because we've seen earlier that you're not allowed to. You just saw that on the daf yesterday. So the Gemara Tosfos later on Daf Chav Zayin says this is referring to where he's having a major loss. And that's what we're discussing, if you're allowed to do work or not. So the Gemara says that for other relatives, one is allowed to choose whether or not he wants to minimize his work activity. For a parent, one must minimize his work activity. Next question is, when they tear kriya, so should he stick his arm out through the hole so that his shoulder is actually exposed? So the Gemara says for other relatives that's optional. For a parent, that is obligatory. Now the Gemara quotes a story. The Gemara says that there was a great sage, one of the Gedoli Hadar, the Gemara says, who lost his father, and he wanted to do this thing where you stick your arm out, what the Gemara calls choletz, that he can actually reveal the shoulder. The Gemara says there was another gadol with him, and he wanted to do a choletz, and together with the first gadol, to show that he's mourning with him, but in order to prevent the second gadol from having to be a choletz, the first gadol was not choletz, and therefore nobody was a choletz. Now the Gemara says, who are these two? Two versions. The first one was Rebbe, and the second one was Rav Yaakov bar Acha, or the first one was Rav Yaakov bar Acha, and the second one was Rebbe. So the Gemara says, I understand if the first one was Rav Yaakov bar Acha, the second one was Rebbe, that's why Rav Yaakov bar Acha did not want Rebbe to do choletz, because it's not appropriate for him to do choletz on the father of Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha. That would be Rav Acha. However, if the first gadol was Rebbe and his father was Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, he was the Nasi Adar, it would be appropriate for Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha to do chilutz for him. So why would he stop him? Why would he himself not do choletz in order to prevent Rabbi Yaakov bar Acha from doing it? Gemara says that is a good question. Gemara leaves it at that. The Gemara does not answer. Okay, next halacha is the halacha of a haircut. When is one allowed to take a haircut? So the Gemara says for other relatives, it's after 30 days. For a parent, it's until his friends and neighbors tell him your hair is too long, you have to do something about that. Now, when are they allowed to join a simcha? So here we have a discussion. So for other relatives, they can join a simcha after 30 days. For a parent, it's after 12 months. Now, what type of simcha is where we have a discussion? Rabbi Bar Chana says this is only referring to what's called simchas mereis. That's a social event where friends get together and they do a suda together, and then they take turns. Person A does a suda, invites B, C, and D to a suda, and then B invites everybody, and then C invites everybody, and then a D. So it's a social event. That is what he's allowed to go to after 30 days for other relatives, and after 12 months for the father, for the parent. Well, it doesn't say after 12 months for the parent. After 30 days for other relatives. However, to a simcha, to an actual simcha, like a wedding, that he would not be allowed to go to even after 30 days. So Gemara has a kasha on that. We have a brisa that says that this is allowed for simcha and mirayos, simcha which implies both a simcha and a social event. So Gemara leaves that as a kasha. But there's another version of this whole discussion where Rabbi Bar Bar Chana says that one is allowed to go to a social event right away, even within 30 days, and he's only allowed to go to a regular simcha. When we say he's only allowed to go to when we say he's only allowed to go to a simcha after 30 days for other relatives, that's referring to a wedding or a real simcha. But within 30 days, like we said, he's allowed to go to a social event, to a Sudas Marias. That the Gemara asks, we have a brisa that puts them on the same level. It says he's allowed to go to a simcha and to a Marias within 30 days. So we end up with is a contradiction between Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, who says he can go to a social event within 30 days, and the brisa says he can only go after 30 days. This we can answer because it depends whose obligation, whose turn it is to make the Suda. If it is the Avel who's just beginning to make the Suda, that he shouldn't go to. However, if it's the Avel's turn to make the Suda, that is, everybody else has already invited him, and now it's his turn to invite them, that he's obligated to do, that he's allowed to do right away, even within 30 days. But to begin, where it's not his obligation, that he shouldn't do until after 30 days. And again, this is all for other relatives. For a parent, one would have to wait until 12 months. All right, now the Gemara goes into the halachos of kriya, tearing the clothing. Again, comparing other relatives to a parent. So the Gemara says, what is the size of the tear? So for other relatives, it's one tefach. That's learned from Vayechazek David b'begada vayikarim. David grabbed his cloak, his clothings, and he tore them. Grabbing usually means grabbing a fistful, so that would be a tefach long tear. Now for a parent though, he has to tear far enough to actually expose his chest. Now, how many garments, how many layers does he have to tear? So for other relatives, just the outer layer. However, for a parent, he has to tear all the layers. The Gemara says that's except for the afgerasuso. Rashi says that means a het. Other Mepharshim say that means the undershirt that is allowed to stay untorn. Now, what about a woman tearing a kriya? So here, the Gemara says that a woman is also obligated in tearing kriya. However, because of tznias, she should make sure that her skin is not visible, so she should tear the outer layer, turn it around so it's behind her, and then she could tear a lower layer. That way the tears don't line up, and she will not be exposing herself. Now, this tear, does it have to be somewhere on the garment other than a widening of the neck hole, or could it just be an extending of the neck hole? The way the garments were made in the days of Chazal was that they just sewed a full shirt without a hole, and then they tore a hole for the head to go through. So if you just tear that further, it just looks like a bigger hole for the head. You don't actually see a recognizable tear. So is that enough, or do you have to actually make a tear somewhere else outside that seam, outside that hem where the neck hole is? So you want to focus on this. The first opinion says that for other relatives, one is allowed to just widen the neck hole. For a parent, one has to make a separate tear. Rabbi Yehuda says even for other relatives, you have to make a separate tear. A tear just widening the neck hole looks like nothing. It's not recognizable at all, and that does not count. Now, the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda learns his halacha from, again, Vayechazik b'bgada vayikarim, and we have a brisa that says l'shnayim, he tore it into two. Obviously, tearing, he tore them means he tore it into two. It means to say that you have to actually tear it in a place where the tear is visible and it looks like two. You have to actually do a serious rend. It cannot just be a widening of the neck hole. Now, next question the Gemara discusses is, can this tear be fixed? So the Gemara says for other relatives it can be fixed after 7 days with rough stitches, uneven temporary stitching, and it can be permanently sewed back after 30 days. For a parent, it can be sewed unevenly, just patched up after 30 days, and it should never be permanently fixed. It should never be properly fixed. Now that's all for a man who's the avel. A woman though should tear it up, should fix it up right away, because it's not covered for her to wear torn clothing, and therefore a woman should always wear clothing that's fixed, and she can fix it up right away. Even for a parent, that's not a problem. Now what should one use to make the tear? So Rav Yochanan tells us that for other relatives one can tear either with his hand or with a kli. A tear with a kli, with a knife, makes a nice smooth cut, and therefore it's much easier to save the garment afterwards. However, for a parent, one has to use the tear of the hand, and that'll pretty much wreck the garment. You can't really fix that afterwards without it looking like a mess. Now, how do you tear it? So Rav Chia bar Abba named Rav Yochanan says other relatives you can tear on the inside or the outside. For parent, you have to tear on the outside. Again, that makes it look much more of a rent clothing. Now, the Gemara discusses what about avelos for a great leader of Klal Yisrael. So Rav Chizda says the same halachos apply to avelos for the nasi. So the Gemara asks a brisa that says that the only other place where you have these halachos of the parent that are similar to anyone else is about the halacha of not sewing things up. So that's the only thing that applies to others, to great leaders. So why would you tell me that the nasi has the same halacha? So Gemara says, no, the nasi is not what this brisa was referring to. The brisa that said that other leaders of Klal Yisrael have the same halacha, only as far as sewing was referring to everybody but the nasi. The nasi has all the same halachos as the father. Okay, the Gemara will continue to go much deeper into the halachos of a nasi on the next daf. We just end off with the story here. The Gemara says Rav Chizda told Rav Hanan bar Abba when the nasi had died, he said, stand on the grinder, stand up so everybody could see, and show them that you tore kriya so that everybody can see the kriya that you tore.